April 18, 1943. The sky above Bougainville hung heavy with tropical heat, thick clouds bruising the horizon like old wounds. At 14,000 feet, the air grew thin and cold, a stark contradiction to the jungle below where steam rose from emerald canopies untouched by civilization. Lieutenant Rex T. Barber felt the P-38 Lightning shudder beneath him, a twin-engine beast of American engineering, all power and velocity, humming with the confidence of a nation that had turned its factories into arsenals. He checked his fuel gauge. 20 minutes. Maybe less. The numbers didn't lie, but neither did the mission brief that morning. Intercept Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the combined fleet, the man whose strategic brilliance had humbled America in a single Sunday morning of fire and chaos. Today, vengeance wore the face of mathematics, timing, trajectory, and one impossible gamble that would demand not bullets, but nerves forged in something deeper than training. The Solomon Islands had become a graveyard of empires, a theater where young men from Iowa and Hokkaido bled into coral and mud for strips of jungle whose names they couldn't pronounce. For 18 months, the Pacific War had been a brutal education in distance, disease, and death. The Japanese Empire, once unstoppable in its sweep across Asia, had begun to feel the weight of overextension. Supply lines stretched thin as spider silk. Island garrisons went hungry. Yet their pilots, those who survived, remained among the most skilled aviators in the world, products of a culture that had spent decades perfecting the art of aerial combat, men who viewed death not as failure, but as the purest form of duty. They flew Mitsubishi Zeros, nimble and lethal, aircraft that could outturn almost anything America fielded in the early years. But the Zero had a fatal flaw. It sacrificed armor for agility, fuel tanks unprotected, pilots exposed. One good burst could turn the rising sun into a falling star. Admiral Yamamoto understood this trade-off better than most. He had studied at Harvard, walked American streets, seen the industrial might that slumbered behind isolationist walls. When ordered to plan the Pearl Harbor attack, he had done so with the precision of a man who knew he was waking a giant, hoping only to cripple it long enough for Japan to secure the resources it desperately needed. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he allegedly confided, though whether he spoke those exact words or whether history invented them for poetry's sake, the sentiment remained true. By April 1943, that giant was fully awake, and it had learned to read Japanese naval codes with the cold efficiency of a locksmith cracking a safe. The intercept order came from the highest levels. Navy cryptanalysts, working in basement rooms in Hawaii, had deciphered Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour itinerary with startling clarity. Departure time, flight path, escort details, even the Admiral's punctuality. Legendary, unshakable, the mark of a man who treated time as currency. 18 P-38 Lightnings would launch from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, flying 435 miles at wavetop altitude to avoid radar detection, climbing only at the last moment to strike. It was assassination disguised as combat, a targeted killing that would later spark debates about the boundaries of warfare and honor. But in the brutal calculus of 1943, with thousands dying weekly across the Pacific, morality took a back seat to momentum. Rex Barber wasn't thinking about philosophy as his P-38 knifed through tropical thermals. He was thinking about fuel, about the 2 Betty bombers that had just appeared in his gun sight, about the 6 Zeros wheeling protectively around them like wolves guarding wounded prey. He was 23 years old, a farm kid from Oregon who'd traded a future of plowing fields for the temporary privilege of flying machines that cost more than his hometown's entire annual budget. The P-38 was an American contradiction. Expensive, complicated, fuel-hungry yet brutally effective when flown by someone who understood its quirks. Twin booms, tricycle landing gear, turbo-supercharged Allison engines that could push the aircraft to 400 miles per hour in level flight. It was not a plane that apologized for its excesses. Lieutenant Tom Lanphier, flying nearby, made the first pass. His guns hammered one of the Betty bombers, engines smoking, the aircraft beginning its death spiral toward the jungle canopy. But the second Betty, Yamamoto's transport, dove for the treetops, its pilot reacting with the trained instinct of a man who'd survived too many fights to panic now. The Zeros swarmed, their pilots among Japan's finest, men who'd trained at Tainan Air Group, who'd flown over China, who knew the weight of protecting the Empire's most valuable strategic mind. They came at the Americans with a fury that turned the sky into geometry. Angles, deflection, lead, lag, every movement a calculation made in the time it takes a heart to beat twice. This is when Rex Barber did something that would be analyzed, debated, and mythologized for the next 80 years. He was being chased. A Zero clung to his tail, flown by a pilot whose name history would never record, but whose skill was undeniable. Tracers stitched the air around Barber's cockpit, close enough to hear, close enough to feel in the vibration of metal skin stressed by velocity. His fuel gauge read critical. The Betty bomber carrying Yamamoto was seconds from disappearing into the jungle, its pilot executing evasive maneuvers with a desperation that spoke of knowing exactly who sat in the rear cabin. Barber had one advantage. The Zero pilot didn't know how low his fuel was, didn't know that the P-38 was minutes from becoming a glider, that every second of full throttle consumed gallons the Lightning couldn't spare. So Barber did what every training manual said never to do. He throttled back, reduced power, slowed down in the middle of a dogfight, presenting his aircraft as an easier target, a wounded bird inviting the kill. The Zero pilot, as Barber gambled he would, interpreted this as damage. Engine hit, controls compromised. The American was finished. The Japanese pilot tightened his turn, angling for the killing shot, closing distance to ensure the next burst would shred cockpit and pilot both. 3 seconds. 2. And then Barber slammed both throttles to war emergency power, the P-38's twin engines screaming as turbochargers force-fed compressed air into cylinders, the aircraft leaping forward with a violence that bordered on mechanical rage. The Zero, committed to its tighter turning radius, couldn't react in time. Barber rolled inverted, pulled through, and came around on the bomber. His 50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon spoke in the universal language of war: brief, conclusive, final. The Betty's right engine exploded in orange flame. The wing folded. The aircraft tumbled into the jungle canopy at over 200 miles per hour, disintegrating on impact, scattering wreckage and secrets across a hillside that wouldn't be fully excavated for decades. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, 59 years old, architect of Japan's naval dominance, gambler who'd bet his nation's future on a single surprise attack, died instantly. His body was found still strapped into his seat, sword at his side, white gloves stained with jungle mud. The man who had predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year before America's industrial power overwhelmed them had been proven correct by his own death. It had been 16 months since Pearl Harbor. The tide was turning. But this is not merely a story of bullets and timing. It is a story about what each side expected and what they found instead. The Japanese Zero pilots escorting Yamamoto's bomber that morning flew with a confidence born from 2 years of aerial supremacy. They had dominated the skies over China, Malaya, the Philippines, sweeping aside opposition with an almost casual efficiency. Their aircraft, when war began, were superior to nearly everything the Allies could field. Lighter, faster turning, longer ranged. Their pilots trained for years, accumulating thousands of hours, a luxury that came from a militaristic culture that poured resources into creating elites. They expected, as they always had, that individual skill and samurai spirit would overcome material disadvantage. They expected Americans to fight with the coordination of factory workers, competent but uninspired, mechanical but soulless. What they encountered instead was something their training hadn't prepared them for: American pragmatism weaponized. The P-38 Lightning wasn't designed to outturn a Zero. It was designed to outclimb it, outdive it, outgun it, and outlast it. Where Japanese aircraft sacrificed protection for a performance, American designs armored their pilots, installed self-sealing fuel tanks, built redundancy into every system. A P-38 could limp home with one engine shot out. A Zero, hit in the fuel tank, became a fireball. This wasn't cowardice, it was mathematics. America had the industrial capacity to build thousands of aircraft and the training programs to produce thousands of pilots. Japan, by 1943, had neither. Every lost ace was irreplaceable. Every downed Zero a resource that couldn't be quickly recovered. Rex Barber's bluff worked because it exploited a cultural assumption. Japanese pilots were trained to recognize signs of damage, to press attacks against wounded prey, to finish fights decisively. The concept of feigning weakness as a tactical maneuver, of deliberately appearing vulnerable to create an opening, ran counter to the Bushido-influenced doctrine that prized direct confrontation. American fighter tactics, by contrast, were evolving rapidly, incorporating lessons from the Royal Air Force, from early Pacific defeats, from fighter pilots who survived and shared what worked: boom and zoom, energy management, never dogfight a Zero below 200 knots, use your speed, your armor, your teamwork, and if necessary, use deception. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese pilots throughout the Pacific War wasn't a weapon, it was abundance. American pilots spoke casually of things that sounded like fantasy to their Japanese counterparts: unlimited fuel, replacement aircraft waiting on carrier decks, spare parts flown in by transport planes, mechanics who could rebuild engines in days rather than weeks. When Japanese ace Saburo Sakai was shot down and injured over Guadalcanal, he flew his damaged Zero 560 miles back to base, navigating with a head wound that had partially blinded him, knowing there was no rescue, no backup, no second chance. When American pilots ditched at sea, submarines surfaced to retrieve them. PT boats raced to their coordinates. Seaplanes landed in enemy waters. The Pacific War became a contest between excellence and abundance, and abundance proved patient, relentless, ultimately insurmountable. Food became another dividing line. Japanese garrisons in the Solomons were starving by 1943, reduced to eating grass, rats, anything that could be chewed and swallowed. Malaria and dysentery killed more men than bullets. Meanwhile, American bases received regular supply ships carrying not just ammunition, but ice cream, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, canned peaches, coffee that didn't taste like burnt bark. This wasn't mere luxury. It was a statement of industrial philosophy. Take care of your soldiers because you can afford to, because machines work better when the operators are healthy, because wars are won in factories as much as foxholes. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated with messages of spiritual superiority over materialistic Americans, found themselves facing an enemy whose materialism was so overwhelming it redefined what was possible in war. The death of Admiral Yamamoto sent shockwaves through the Japanese Naval Command. He had been not just a strategist, but a symbol, a man who'd opposed war with America, yet executed it with devastating skill when ordered, a figure respected even by enemies. His loss was covered up for weeks, the truth hidden from the public. A state funeral held in June with full military honors. Emperor Hirohito himself attended, a rare gesture that underscored how irreplaceable Yamamoto had become. In the strategic rooms of Tokyo, planners realized that if their most important military leader could be killed with such precision, nowhere was safe. No one was beyond reach. American intelligence, they now understood, had penetrated their codes. The psychological impact rivaled the tactical loss. For the American pilots involved, the mission became a case study in operational security. They were forbidden from discussing details, ordered to submit vague after-action reports, told that the true nature of their mission must remain classified lest Japan realize its codes were broken. Rex Barber and Tom Lanphier would spend the rest of their lives debating who fired the fatal shots, a controversy that soured their friendship and spawned decades of historical analysis. But the argument missed the larger point. The mission succeeded not because of individual heroism, but because of systemic advantages: intelligence networks, long-range aircraft, coordinated tactics, and yes, fuel enough to fly 870 miles round-trip over enemy territory. The bluff that Rex Barber employed that April morning above Bougainville was a microcosm of the Pacific War itself. Japan had bet on qualitative superiority, on the unbreakable spirit of warriors trained from childhood to embrace death, on tactical brilliance overcoming numerical disadvantage. America bet on quantity, on systems, on the cold logic that trained pilots flying armored planes with good radios and reliable engines would, over time, grind down even the most skilled opponents. The bluff worked because Barber understood his enemy's expectations and turned them into a trap. He played the role of wounded prey so convincingly that his pursuer lowered his guard for just the 2 seconds necessary. And 2 seconds in aerial combat is an eternity. There exists, preserved in the archives, a photograph of Yamamoto taken days before his death. He sits in a wicker chair at Rabaul Airfield, surrounded by officers, his expression unreadable, a man carrying the weight of strategic decisions that had sent thousands to their deaths and would soon claim his own life. He wears the white dress uniform of an admiral, sword at his side, the embodiment of a military tradition stretching back centuries. Within a week, he would be dead on a jungle hillside, and the sword would be recovered by Australian soldiers who didn't immediately realize what they'd found. That photograph captures a moment of transition, an old kind of warfare, rooted in honor and personal courage and the belief that spirit could triumph over steel, colliding with a new kind, industrial and systematic and utterly indifferent to individual valor. The P-38 Lightning that Rex Barber flew that day was scrapped after the war, melted down, its metal repurposed into the peacetime economy that would define the post-war American century. The Zero that chased him vanished into historical anonymity, its pilot's name unknown, his story untold, except as a footnote to someone else's victory. Such is the nature of war. We remember the bluff, the gamble, the 2 seconds of throttle manipulation that changed the outcome. We forget the 1,000 hours of training that taught a young pilot from Oregon how to manage engine power under stress, the mechanics who kept those temperamental Allison engines running in tropical heat, the codebreakers who made the entire mission possible. Victory is rarely authored by individuals. It is compiled by systems, by cultures, by the accumulated choices of millions. And yet, the bluff matters. It matters because in that instant, Rex Barber embodied a truth about American warfare that would define the century: adaptability over rigidity, pragmatism over doctrine, the willingness to break rules when rules become obstacles. He wasn't supposed to throttle back in combat. Every manual said it was suicide. But he read the situation, understood his opponent's mindset, and made a choice that should have killed him, but instead killed an admiral. That capacity for improvisation, for making the unorthodox choice under pressure, became a hallmark of American military culture. It wasn't always pretty. It wasn't always honorable in the old sense, but it worked. By the time the sun set on April 18, 1943, the Pacific War had shifted imperceptibly, but irrevocably. Japan's greatest naval strategist was dead, killed by an enemy he'd always feared. Not because Americans were better warriors, but because they had the luxury of making mistakes, learning from them, and returning stronger. The bluff that fooled Japan's escort pilots was part of a larger bluff, that America's industrial might, its vast resources, its willingness to grind down opponents through sheer material superiority was somehow ungentlemanly, somehow less worthy than the spiritual purity of warriors who accepted death with grace. But wars are not judged by aesthetics. They are decided by outcomes. And the outcome, already visible in 1943 to those willing to see it, was a foregone conclusion. In the decades that followed, military historians would study the Yamamoto mission as a masterclass in intelligence-driven operations. Aviation enthusiasts would debate the kill credits. But the real lesson was simpler and more profound. In modern war, the side that can afford to bluff, that has enough fuel to risk a gamble, enough pilots to lose one without catastrophic consequence, enough industrial base to replace losses faster than they accumulate, will eventually prevail. Rex Barber's desperate maneuver wasn't desperate at all. It was the calculated risk of a man flying an aircraft backed by the productive capacity of a continent. His Japanese pursuer, skilled and brave, flew on behalf of an empire already running out of fuel, spare parts, and time. The jungle swallowed Admiral Yamamoto's body, his aircraft, his final moments. But it could not swallow the meaning of his death. A war that Japan had started with a surprise attack, hoping to cripple American resolve, had turned into a war of attrition that only one side could sustain. The man who understood this better than anyone, who had warned his government of the risks, became its most prominent victim. And the weapon that killed him wasn't just bullets or tactics. It was the suffocating abundance of an enemy who could afford to send 18 fighters on a one-way gamble and consider it a reasonable expenditure. Who could train pilots to break doctrine when necessary? Who could bluff because they had the fuel to back it up? Freedom, it turned out, was heavier than steel. It arrived in the form of spare parts, replacement aircraft, pilots who could eject and fly again tomorrow. It manifested as the luxury to innovate, to question orders, to try unorthodox tactics without fearing dishonor. And on one April morning above the Solomon Islands, it looked like a P-38 Lightning slowing down in a dogfight, waiting 2 heartbeats, then roaring back to life in a burst of American horsepower and one pilot's gamble that his enemy would mistake pragmatism for weakness. The bluff worked. The admiral died, and the war, already decided in factories and training schools and code-breaking rooms, rolled onward with the terrible inevitability of mathematics made flesh.